I'd like to welcome Calumn Hamilton, who is a researcher at the University of Groningen, Emmanuel Mensah, who is an assistant professor at Utrecht University. They'll be presenting their paper on structural transformation, which I'm sure everyone will find very interesting. And then we have Zakiswa Kimani from the DTIC, who's chief director, Elvis Avenio from the University of Johannesburg, professor, and then Isaac Karusha, who is a director at the National Treasury, all working in this space. So welcome and thank you.
Yeah, we lost our first slide. Never mind. All right. So you would have seen, if we had the first slide, that we are presenting a paper entitled The Structural Change Emergency in South Africa. There it is. Firstly, we would like to express gratitude to ERSA for inviting us here and for allowing us to write for them. It's the sort of dream of academics to have anyone in policy listen to us. So the fact that you provide this opportunity for us to present to such a policy-focused audience is very welcome. Secondly, we would like to apologize because we are the outsiders here. We are not South African, either of us, so we are instead people who work in structural transformation, who we have a toolbox that we use to analyze structural change and its contribution to growth, and we wanted to apply that toolbox to South Africa, to the post-apartheid South African experience, and see what came out, and particularly to see what came out in light of what is actually quite a rapidly changing literature, rapidly growing in terms of importance and rapidly changing in terms of focus. I wanted to show you something. I forgot to bring it with me, but on the desk here there is this lovely News 24 on the record brochure. And chapter 4 says, Manufacturing, Our Engine for Growth. And it says, manufacturing is not just another sector, it is the one sector, one of the few tools that can help fix structural damage in the labor market, local economies, and municipal systems. So we want to argue, or at least provide some evidence that whilst manufacturing is still important and still has a big role to play, that not only is it perhaps not the exclusive driver of growth and employment, but it need not be the perhaps necessarily the first priority for South Africa or for emerging and middle-income economies in general that it was previously thought to be. So here is the backdrop to our paper. Traditional manufacturing-led development, the type advocated in this brochure, is struggling to take off. Not just in Africa, but in large parts of the emerging world. We have a small concentration of big manufacturing success stories in East Asia, China and the so-called Asian tigers before. And we have a lot of other countries which have sought to replicate this experience in various means, all with quite limited success. And frankly, the only countries which seem to be doing it successfully are mostly other countries in that region, Indonesia, Vietnam, etc. Manufacturing employment growth such that it is in other African countries, of which South Africa is atypical, is largely characterized by informal manufacturing growth in most parts of Africa. And the South African manufacturing sector is not very informal. The South African economy is far less informal than that of other African countries and many other developing countries, and particularly the manufacturing sector. So even this kind of growth through informal manufacturing, which is productivity enhancing, albeit at a lesser degree than formal manufacturing, is less viable for South Africa than for other countries in the region. South Africa is an atypically rich African country, manufacturing sector is mostly formal, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the premature deindustrialization hypothesis by Danny Roderick, suggesting that African countries, or modern developing countries, and particularly African countries, are commencing their deindustrialization process at premature income levels. It's not natural for an economy to move through agriculture to manufacturing to services. Roderick argued that countries now were beginning this deindustrialization process prematurely. Emmanuel and I showed that actually this isn't a general case for sub-Saharan Africa, that it's a product of a small rich country by a sample, but a sample including 4 countries which are prematurely deindustrializing, and one of those is South Africa. Recent work on structural change in South Africa, a book-length treatment by Andrew Edroni et al., shows concern for the state of structural change in South Africa in the 2010s. It was published in 2021, but the analysis within it covers sort of up to, shall we say, pre-COVID, and particularly discusses a stagnation of manufacturing productivity and a switch to investment in more profitable non-tradable services. And it presents this very much as a bad thing. Globally, however, the nature of manufacturing and services are changing. Manufacturing is not what it was in the 1990s. It's far more capital intensive, far more automated, with greater future potential to be so. I'm talking about the formal part of manufacturing, the part which is most relevant to South Africa. And similarly, services is much more tradable than it ever was before as a sector. And not just are there more tradable sectors, but there's also increasing thought about how we actually think about tradability of services. You know, if a hub such as Cape Town is able to provide great restaurants, great hotels and vineyards such as this, all of which we would traditionally think as non-tradable, but they act as a magnet for consumers across South Africa, frankly across Southern Africa, even across the world, then they are actually, you know, able to facilitate quite a large market and to be able to scale in a way that traditional non-tradables were not thought to be able to do so. Similarly, we tend to conceptualize structural transformation as shifts between sectors, as shifts between, say, agriculture, manufacturing, and services. But sort of newer thinking on this is that, well, that's not the only set of transformations which we would reasonably call structural transformation, right? There is the changes from informal to formal activities. There's female labor force participation. There's upgrading of different types of firms within sectors, of people moving from producing for home to producing for market, a whole range of transformations which statistically would show up as within sector productivity growth. So may not be captured as structural transformation in our traditional view, but it's very important for how countries grow and how they could potentially grow rapidly. So against this backdrop, we seek to set the structural change experience of South Africa not just in comparative perspective with its own past and with other sort of peer economies, both BRICS and leading African economies, but also in comparative perspective with a changing literature. What we're going to show is that if one was to look at structural transformation in South Africa through a purely manufacturing lens, then one would feel very, very pessimistic. But this may not be the only lens through which to look at it. So we ask the following questions. More generally, we ask what has been the contribution of structural change to growth in South Africa. Here we are talking about inter-industry structural change and within-sector growth in the decades since apartheid. We are asking how this has changed over time in terms of its sectoral composition and also in comparison with regional and peer economies. And sort of following from that, we want to say, well, were the 2010s, the decade which preceded this one, as bad as you know, the sort of case study-based literature and overview literature might suggest? Yes, we find that it was. And are there signs of recovery? And yes, we find that there are. We then ask, can services contribute meaningfully to structural change in South Africa, or can they even lead structural change? Can or should they be a focus for industrial policy? What is the role of international versus domestic demand? And what are the implications for policymakers in South Africa? And my co-author, Emmanuel, will take over this presentation once we get to the policy discussion stage. So as economists, we tend to give you our findings right at the start, so we don't keep you in suspense, and we are going to do so now. We find, I mean, maybe we just wanted a catchy title, but we think that the structural change performance using our measures at any rate in the 2010s was so bad that it might be considered a structural change emergency. That's the name of our paper. And this is a sort of a sort of three-part problem, if you like, where we had negative overall labor productivity growth. We had either negative or negligibly small productivity growth within all sort of major broad sectors. And we had growth-reducing structural change, which is, on average, workers relocating from more to less productive sectors, right? So, you know, in the structural change literature, we get a sort of... It's not unrelated, in fact, to what Mr. Andrews was saying about firms, that if we have, even with no productivity growth within sectors at all, if workers can relocate from less to more productive sectors on average, then this can boost growth. But conversely, if the opposite happens, then it can be a drag on growth. This emergency, you know, the word emergency suggests a kind of atypical setting or a unique setting, and we argue that this is a fair use of the word because it stands out compared both to previous decades in South Africa and also to other regions and countries that we consider to be reasonable comparators. Yes, and we will see this clearly in our analysis. But there are signs of a post-2020 recovery. Labor productivity growth on average is back up above 1% per annum. That's not particularly high, but at least it's not negative. At least it's a positive number with some kind of meaningful economic magnitude. And structural change is now acting in a positive direction, in that labor is now again relocating from less to more productive sectors. We, of course, must give the caveat that this is a post-COVID period, so there were a lot of adjustments, particularly in kind of, you know, pent-up demand and things like this. So it remains to be seen the extent to which these factors will be sustained. But despite this recovery, productivity growth, well, it's slower, but more importantly, it's much less balanced than in the pre-emergency decade, right? And particularly, it's dominated by services. So it's driven almost entirely by either productivity growth within services or a contribution of relocation of labor towards services from less productive sectors on average, right? It's whereas, and we'll show this, whereas before it was again, nothing incredible, but pretty balanced performance between sectors. Now it's an entirely services-led story, and value added in jobs embodied in exports are constant over time, also by sector, but with services comprising a larger share over time. Productivity within manufacturing, mining, and other industry is declining rapidly or even worse than it was in the emergency decade. And this is a common feature of provinces of South Africa, not just concentrated in the economic powerhouse provinces. We put this against a backdrop of a changing literature where, and the paper contains a pretty lengthy, maybe too lengthy overview of the literature, but it gives a pretty comprehensive primer for those interested both in what it was and what it is. The basis of the argument is that technological progress and geopolitical shifts have resulted in fundamental changes in both sectors, right? So it's not just that it's not just that the nature of manufacturing has changed and the way manufacturing goods are traded has changed, the nature of services has changed, but also the world has changed since 1990, since the great Asian success stories, right? There are trade frictions now and geopolitical shifts to the extent that the assumption of a kind of quasi-infinite global market, particularly for larger, bulkier goods, is no longer necessarily true. And similarly, digital innovation and declines in digital barriers maybe have the opposite effect for the tradability of services, and AI can contribute to this too. So 10 years ago or so, Roderick famously said that only the manufacturing sector exhibited this unconditional convergence property, that only through manufacturing could countries converge to the global productivity level or the level of global productivity leaders, right? And this is why, this kind of narrative of the unique properties of manufacturing emerged. It was also believed that among the modern sectors of the economy, manufacturing had a unique capacity to absorb low-skilled labor en masse, which was, such a key priority for policy and is such a key priority for South African policy. But by 2022, even Roderick himself acknowledged that this landscape may have changed, that it's not actually manufacturing which is unique, but it's modernity and formality, which is unique, right? So also, Herendorf et al. Exploring the unconditional convergence hypothesis found that it actually doesn't hold for all manufacturing. It just holds for the sort of formal, more high-tech form of manufacturing, and that it can also hold for that part of services and other sectors. So, in a world, to use Baldwin and Forsley's language, where manufacturing is jobless and services are tradable, we are against, we maybe need to rethink how we think about manufacturing and services. So I'm not going to go into much detail about the data because this is a policy presentation. Needless to say that we use data from Stats SA and data from Groningen, where both Emmanuel and I worked on major structural change databases and also input-output data too. So we look first at the structural conditions in South Africa as of 2024, I think. We see that, so this graph plots the average productivity by sector by the height of the bars and the share of employment in each sector by the width of the bars. We see that agriculture has become a very small sector, or relatively small sector in South Africa, very unlike other African countries, and that won't surprise you having seen the presentation of this morning. We see that services in the middle here, particularly these two big blocks of trade services and personal services, the green and the yellow, containing a very substantial chunk of employment, and both of them are below average in terms of their labor productivity. If we look at how the relative sizes of sectors have changed over time, this is not monotonic, but it is showing clear general trends towards quite a strong decline in the employment share of agriculture, and the presentation this morning talked about this as a bad thing, but conventional structural transformation theory would actually see this as a not just a good but a necessary part of the structural transformation process, depending of course on where these workers relocate to. And the big expansion is coming particularly in trade services and some of the other services sectors. We then perform a shift share decomposition technique where we can, just a growth accounting technique where we can decompose average labor productivity growth, aggregate labor productivity growth, into that part which is caused by within sector growth, by sectors themselves becoming more efficient or more productive, and we can divide this up into the different sectors, and between sector productivity growth, that is the relocation of labor from more to less productive sectors, holding their initial productivity levels constant. And this is what we see with South Africa, and this is, I guess, what we describe as the structural change emergency, you see? So, you will immediately see that 2010 to 2019 is a very, very, very compressed bar. On average, labor productivity growth is slightly negative. That's across the whole decade, right? We have structural change, this orange term, is negative. That means labor relocating on average to less productive sectors. We see productivity growth within other industries declining. And then within mining, within services, within manufacturing, it's positive but negligibly small, right? This is a big contrast to the decade preceded it, where productivity growth was a healthy 2%, or even slightly more on average, and it was quite balanced, you see, between growth within services, growth within manufacturing, a bit of productivity growth within agriculture, and positive structural change supplementing that with workers relocating on average to more productive sectors. And it's just a little tail off in mining productivity is the only negative part there. Now, from 2024 onwards, we see this sort of semi-recovery, green shoots of recovery, if you like. Aggregate productivity growth is positive again. It's above 1%, not great, but not terrible. But you see it's dominated by this purple bar, by within-sector productivity growth in the services sector, and a little bit of positive structural change of, again, workers relocating from either more to less to more productive services subsectors, or into services from agriculture. We see that manufacturing and other industry are actually now still contributing negatively, or in the case of manufacturing, has turned negative in their contribution of overall productivity growth. And this has come alongside a general pattern of deindustrialization, and these are the results of regressions where we've held constant demand. So we hold GDP and population constant, although the results are not really different if we have them unconditional. And we also pull out our province fixed effects, and we see, and we can also then get some confidence intervals on this with a Taylor approximation. And we see that in almost every province, we have declines in the relative share, so this is the share of employment, of manufacturing employment, and in most cases also of manufacturing value added, and particularly strongly in the economic powerhouse provinces, Western Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, and Gauteng. And with services, completely the opposite story, right? We see a servicification pattern across the board in South Africa. And this stands out in international comparison, right? This wasn't that the 2010s was a terrible decade for labor productivity growth or structural transformation the world over. The BRICS average was, okay, not as great in the 2010s as the 2000s, but still positive and balanced. The African average was a bit less balanced, but still positive. It's really South Africa that has this very compressed labor productivity growth. Now, of course, it's not the only country when we look sort of at more explicit comparisons. You know, Nigeria had a poor performance in the 2010s too, Brazil did, but even these were more sort of radically bad performance in one single sector rather than just a decade of almost nothingness, right? And by province, we see that, you know, the pattern fairly well. So here's the 2010 to 2019, with maybe the minor exception of the Free State and Northern Cape. We see this sort of condensed pattern almost uniformly across provinces, and also the recovery. Important to say so too, almost uniformly across provinces, although a little weaker in Gauteng compared to the others. If we look now at this within services productivity growth by province, we can see again, you know, the sort of, you know, almost nothingness in the 2010s, but now we're most interested in characterizing this recovery. Well, we see a good chunk of it is finance and business services, and it's not just in the province, you know, it's not just in Gauteng and Western Cape. It's pretty generally across, representing something of a diffusion of these services. But we also see personal services productivity is growing, right? But what we don't see almost anywhere except in Mpumalanga is rapid within-sector growth in trade services. And now that's important, right? Because it was trade services that was having quite a lot of employment moving towards it nationally. And when we look at non-services productivity growth by province, we see this general negative pattern, actually more negative in the 2020s, in the last years, in the recovery period, than it was in the emergency decade, right? We see you know, a pretty strong pattern of either nothing or negative productivity growth within sectors other than the services sectors. Finally, well, not finally, but finally in terms of empirics, we characterize jobs embodied in trade using this input-output technique, and we show that, so we see that the proportion of jobs embodied in trade by sector or overall is fairly constant. On the one hand, this is good in that it at least hasn't dropped off, but on the other hand, it does sort of imply that there isn't much new gains, right? At least in relative terms. So the sort of the boundary of what might be achievable with traditional trading partners might have been hit. I don't go through these in detail, other than to note that you know, the proportion of services jobs and manufacturing jobs is nothing particularly transformative. My one last slide before I hand over to Emmanuel is just from another paper we did looking at some similar analysis for East Africa. This is just to show you what a sort of what we call a kind of good services-led structural transformation might look like, right? Now, this is not to say that we take this with a little pinch of salt, right? Because the average East African country has a much lower initial productivity level than South Africa. So growth is by definition going to, smaller changes will translate to higher growth rates. But still, what we see here is the same sort of pattern of a sudden 2010s, a sudden recent boom within services productivity growth. So services kind of taking over as this engine of productivity growth with structural change towards services too. But we see the other sectors also growing to some degree and not acting as a drag. So services has taken the lead, but the other sectors are still contributing. And this together has allowed a decade of almost above 3% productivity growth on annum, which whilst not at 1990s Chinese level is still a very, very healthy performance. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Calumn, for going through the empirics. I don't have time. I have like 2 minutes so I'll just summarize the policy.
You could take out of the panel time. Right?
No, I mean, okay. Yeah, so I can summarize it in like 2 minutes, then we can continue. I'll not go through the how do you okay, going back. Okay, I'll not summarize the results. So what is the implication of this for policy in South Africa? Right, so regardless of your view about the role of manufacturing and services, 3 things are clear from the empirics, okay? The first one is it's not really about choosing between manufacturing and services, but it's about getting the policy right. And one could say that South Africa could lean fully into services-led growth part and then ignore industry or manufacturing completely. Another school of thought is to revive industry to restore the balanced growth pattern that we saw in the post-apartheid period. But regardless of the choice, 3 things must be clear to policymakers. The first is to stop the industrial decline. So from the evidence that Calumn presented, we see that declines in labor productivity growth in industry, in manufacturing, is acting as a drag on overall labor productivity, and that is not what we want going forward. The second is that if manufacturing is becoming more capital intensive, more automated, it's not going to be the mass absorber of low-skilled workers that we saw in the 90s in the case of China and other East Asian countries. Services can do that. Services can provide the employment that a mass employment for unskilled labor that we have in Africa. But for this to drive growth, for the reallocation of workers from lower productivity to services to drive growth, we need to raise productivity within sector. This is where within sector productivity becomes important. This is where Dan's presentation becomes important, and I'll talk briefly about that. And the last thing from the empirics is to diversify export markets. It seems that the value added that is embodied in export, that is the income embodied in export, and jobs that is embodied in export is fairly constant from the 1990s. This shows that maybe there is a limit to the traditional export market that South Africa export to, and therefore we need new export destinations. We need stronger south-to-south trade and deeper within African trade. All right, so my time is almost up, so I'll summarize. The key thing that South Africa needs is a dual strategy. So there is a unique role for manufacturing and for services. Again, I want to emphasize that looking at the global manufacturing technology that is emerging, manufacturing won't serve as a mass employer of low-skilled workers like it did in the past. But it can serve as a source of value added. It can serve as a source of technological innovation. And it can serve as a source of demand for services. So these are the 3 things. And services, so if manufacturing is performing the role of creating value added, innovation, and demand linkages, then creating employment for especially the low-skilled people in society falls on services, right? So services will be, going forward, will be the mass absorber of low-skilled workers. And therefore, we need some industrial policy for services. Right. So finally, I want to talk about, but how do you grow services to expand and employ more workers? So you need to address two things. So we need to distinguish between market distortion and structural barriers. Dan talked a lot about market distortion and therefore the need for structural reform and so forth and so forth. But one thing that must be clear is that market reforms is good because market distortion misaligns incentives, which is important. But structural barriers define the feasible frontier of change. And I'll give you an example here. So the first, if, let's say there's exchange rate misalignment, and there's this regulation or deregulation to remove the misalignment, maybe firms will have access to foreign exchange to trade. But if there's no electricity to produce, then these market reforms won't add much to growth and productivity. So going forward, what we need to distinguish and what you need to prioritize is addressing the foundation barriers to structural transformation. And what I mean the foundational barriers is like infrastructure, human capital, health, and so forth and so forth. And this is more, in my view, is first order, in first order than just market. Market reform is important, but addressing the foundation barriers to structural transformation is very important. And I think with that, I'll just end. My time is up, so I'll end here and talk more about it during the conversation. Thank you.
So Emmanuel will take the first round of questions, which will come, I guess, starting with Elvis. Not questions, but comments.
Comments. Yes. No, thanks, Calumn and Emma. I would want to sort of begin by saying that the policy paper is important, and it does provide some compelling sort of description of the pattern of structural transformation in South Africa. But I do have some reflections, also because Emma and I have been at some of these, I've been having some of these discussions since our PhD days. So he does know some my theoretical positions, particularly considering manufacturing, but also how they are interpreting, and then how they are aligning some of the results to some of the policy implications in the context. And I want to start off on, in my view, sort of a broader issue around whether what we see emerging is actually about structural change failure or premature sort of servicification, right? We do know from the literature already that sort of structural transformation have been relatively sort of consistent theoretically. And this is also portrayed sort of quite recently by China and some of the East Asian tigers. And what is also known is that these countries experience structural transformation from a perspective where we've seen some productivity rising across the different sectors that we're considering. So in the process of sort of transitioning towards agriculture, from agriculture to manufacturing, it wasn't that sort of productivity in services wasn't rising, it was, but productivity in manufacturing was just rising much more than each of these other sectors. And then we see the sort of the transition now also to services, where services has literally replaced the productivity growth in other sectors. So what is emerging, particularly from your paper, is the fact that things are different in South Africa. South Africa's pattern and trajectory is quite completely different. We know now that South Africa didn't achieve the large-scale industrial employment before it started the servicification started to occur, right? Yeah. So we do know that. So from that perspective, I think the issue may not necessarily be about premature industrialization per se, but there must also be that, and this goes back to the more disease sort of discussions around how we have sort of prematurely transitioned into the service sector. So I just wanted to have a quick thought on that, given that we don't necessarily have sort of industrial deepening before this is happening. So I think that might be a sort of a key sort of reflection that I want you to have. My second point concerns the nature of services, sector expansion, but also sort of the employment share, right? Yeah. And we've seen the keynote sort of discussing some heterogeneities across firms, but we do know also there are lots of heterogeneities even within service sectors. Yeah. Also because not all services are equal, and you've also shown from one of like most of your slides some heterogeneity in sort of business and finance sectors, but also from a very non-service sectors. What has also emerged is also the fact that some of these average productivity gains are largely in urban sectors. So we do see some inequality as well, right? So we see both heterogeneity and inequality. So what I want to ask you, particularly regarding this, is what is the nature of labor that's being reallocated into some of the sectors, service sectors that are growing, particularly in terms of contracts, particularly in terms of wages, right? Because I think that's also quite important, because you were emphasizing issues around skills and how the service sector is offering opportunities for mass employment. Yeah. And mass employment then sort of brings issues around sort of decent employment, right? So this is a discussion. The next point is a discussion sort of we keep having, and I remember we had this also in Nairobi last week, around the fact that there is no country currently that has achieved a high income status without actually having sort of a high or a very developed industrial base, right? And contemporaneously we do have the case of China and India, which we keep discussing every time. So a question I want to ask briefly around that is the way you are positioning the service-led sort of findings. Do you see service sector generating such outcomes? Yep. And whether you see they playing some of those sort of the complementary roles that industrialization traditionally plays. And here I'm referring to issues around linkages, right? I want to go on quickly to two additional points around, and I think this also came up in your discussion on your conclusion slides about the fact that manufacturing has never been purely a labor-saving, sort of a labor-absorbing sector. Because
now.
Yes, now. And then you went on to make the point that that holds because it is increasingly capital intensive and therefore less sort of capable of absorbing labor. I do agree generally with that statement, but I think it's also quite important to recognize historically that the manufacturing sector has always been exposed to sort of mechanization, right? And what comes to mind immediately is around the sort of the Luddites movement in the first industrial revolution. So despite this sort of movement, we've seen industrialization playing key roles and generating some dynamic spillovers around tech learning, around sort of productivity upgrading, and then of course you touched on the export capabilities that I imagine. So do we see some of these dynamic capabilities appearing in your input-output tables? And if you see it, what role can services play in that? And lastly here, and I think this also comes back to some of the policy recommendations you're trying to draw around the need to broaden the definition of industrial policy, which I fundamentally disagree with. And in that spirit, I was also quite surprised that your analysis doesn't necessarily cover or engage more specifically with some of the sectors that are driving transformation in South Africa. And here I'm referring largely to high-value agriculture, right? There's a lot of work that's been done on how, let's say, citrus and wine is generating sort of export competitiveness, but also some large degree of industrial learning. And the way I rationalize that when reading your paper is that you did not necessarily disaggregate agriculture and manufacturing, right? You kept that data at the highly aggregated level, but you went on to disaggregate services. And the reason why you're emphasizing, and I'm starting to be corrected, the heterogeneity that's emerging in the services is because that the data allows you to do that. So if we disaggregate manufacturing and we disaggregate agriculture, wouldn't we be seeing the same dynamics that we are seeing in services? And then if you see those dynamics, how then do we sort of rationalize the findings that are emerging? So to conclude, and I do know that you did emphasize in the conclusion that the question is not about a choice between service-led transformation or manufacturing-led transformation. But in the paper, you actually said it's a choice, right?
No.
Okay. But in my view, the challenge is not even about a choice at all. I think the challenge is more about how do we rebuild structural transformation strategies that combines both productive agriculture, and here I'm referring largely to sort of high-value agriculture, industrial upgrading, here I'm referring to industrial activities, if you're able to do the disaggregation, that is still growing and still quite productive, right? But also then coming back to the services, combining it with some of the service sectors that you see that is growing here, and then trying to come up with a policy that sort of drive some of these transformations. I think that might be a sort of a better approach rather than pitching sort of sectors against each other.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we take now the response from Isaac Kurasha, and then Emmanuel will respond to all of it.
Briefly. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel and Calumn, for the interesting paper. And I think there are two things that I want to sort of focus on that attracted my attention. You mentioned the tradability of services. And in one of your recommendations, you spoke about the diversification of markets. I want to start off a little bit backwards and bring in the South African dimension a little bit further. Firstly, starting with the issue of the tradability of services. That is quite correct. If you look at services exports globally, they've grown from about 783 million in 1995, that is 783 billion in 1995 US dollars, to about 7.9 trillion in 2023. And that is growing at an average annual growth rate of about 8.6%. Then I also want to bring in the dimension that the top 10 global exports, service exports, they are mainly dominated by a few developed countries. If you exclude China and India, there is no developing country in there. Then if you move further, in that 7.9 trillion US dollars global service exports trade, 2.2% is from Africa. And then if you split the 2.2% in Africa, it's mainly driven by probably a few countries, Egypt being the top, Morocco being the second, South Africa being the third. I'm bringing this dimension also in the context of structural change. Then if you go further into the composition and growth of South African service exports trade, it's quite interesting that for South Africa, actually what we saw is that the proportion of services exports to total exports has actually declined quite significantly between 1995 and 2023, from about 11.3% to about 6%. That is quite massive. And this is taking place actually going in contrast with the global trends, where we see an 8.6 growth in average, but for South Africa it's actually going downwards. And what we also see is that within South Africa, there are modern services that are, which are including your finances, business services, your engineering, management, consulting, all those. Those are the modern services that attract more value. But in the case of South Africa, it's dominated by the traditional services, which is travel and transportation. Now, if you go further into this, into South Africa, you would also want to bring in the question. I think earlier people spoke about the service sector being the biggest, having the biggest proportion of the GDP in South Africa. But when you look at from the export perspective, the proportion of service exports is actually very low, around 6%. So it's another structural issue that one wants to think about. Then you ask yourself, despite the increasing tradability of services activities globally, why is the opposite happening in South Africa? Probably it's another question that one would want to get a deeper understanding. Why the service exports for South Africa, or the service sector for South Africa, is a weak outward orientation? Is it because of the nature of our service trade policies? Is it because of the nature of the industry skills that are required in some of the sectors? That is quite critical. Now, I wanted to point out, I think in terms of your the recommendation that you made about diversifying markets, I think that was profound for me when I look at the structure of South Africa's service exports, that 75% of South Africa's service exports is actually dominated by developed countries, right? And again, if you remove China and India, you find that there is no developing country. And in that as well, we find that service exports to Africa is considered a very small share of South Africa's service exports over the period. Then again, one would wonder, what is the problem? Why are we not able to export more within Africa, especially in the context that we have some trade arrangements, such as the global blocks like SADC, as well as the upcoming African Continental Free Trade Area. And I guess an examination of lack of integration or tapping more into the African market is quite critical. But what are the barriers that are stopping, preventing, a more, strong growth or entry into these particular markets? It's quite, surprising. Then the last thing for me, I think earlier in the morning, somebody spoke about economic complexity, which I think is quite critical for me to understand in the context of the services exports for South Africa. Where does South Africa have a higher revealed comparative advantage in the service sector, especially those particular segments of the service sector that can drive more service exports. So I would agree with you that having looked at the distribution or the main destinations of the service exports for South Africa, there is a high concentration of the destinations, developed countries, just a few, African countries, just a few. So indeed, there is a need to, from a policy perspective, to expand into those markets, and obviously have more negotiations to open up the tight regulations on service exports. And I would want to think that probably the protocol on services for the African Continental Free Trade Area, once it is operationalized, probably it's going to open more markets. Thank you.
Thanks. And now we ask the comment from Zukishwa Kimani.
Thank you, Calumn and Emmanuel, for that insightful paper. I must say, I think this paper comes at an opportune time for me in particular, because we're in the process of developing an industrial policy for the country, and we have had to contend with a lot of criticisms around focusing on the manufacturing sector. We've been asked, why are we betting on a dying horse? Because globally, the manufacturing sector, contribution of the manufacturing sector to GDP is going down. And even in the case of South Africa, if you look at from 1990, it was around 21%, but now we're looking at about 13%. And the question that we keep on we are being asked is, why should you focus on this? And I think your paper, I think it makes enough, it makes a strong business case as to why should we, as a state, focus on that. And for me, it is a bit sobering, and it also brings a perspective that we may not necessarily think about. And what we're also dealing with internally is the issue now of services is coming up quite a lot. I know that Elvis disagrees that we have to also include services as part of our industrial policy. But I want to agree with you that I think we need to pivot because the environment that we're facing, prevailing circumstances are quite different. But what I would have loved to see is nuancing your paper, especially for the South African environment. And I asked myself, looking at the results of your paper, why did this structural emergency change occur? And from where I'm sitting, it is not because as a country we've lacked ambition where industrial policy is concerned. We have had a lot of policies in South Africa, whether it's the economic policies or industrial policies, but I'll just mention just a few. For example, we've had the Industrial Policy Action Plan of 2007, 2012. We also had the NDP, I think it was spoken about earlier in the morning. And the key objective of these policies, especially when we look at the Industrial Policy Action Plan, was to foster structural change within the South African economy, where we're looking at diversifying away from this mineral-based industrialization, focusing more on manufacturing. We've also had, I think, maybe towards the 2019-2020 sectoral master plans, which are also looking at issues of upgrading, trying to build dynamism within the South African economy. And for me, all these that I'm mentioning, they are also raising questions, and quite uncomfortable questions, because we have had this, and I think they call for an introspection where government is concerned. So for me, that is why I'm approaching this from a policy, situating my comments around industrial policy. But we also need to look at the South African economy. That's why I was bringing the issue of nuancing. If you look at the South African economy, looking at the manufacturing sector, it has had to contend with a lot of structural constraints, which continue to be a problem even today. I think you've touched on what is happening globally, which is also is having a bearing on the South African economy and what we are trying to do going forward where industrial policy is concerned. The issues of electricity instability, which also, when I looked at your period, they coincided. From 2008, the global financial crisis has had an impact on how the South African economy or the manufacturing sector has performed over time. You're looking at logistics bottlenecks, which were spoken about earlier on. And what we've also seen is weak investment growth within the South African economy. So one would argue that industrial policy cannot offset all this by itself. Your paper also makes an important contribution. Yes, as we are focused on reviving the manufacturing sector, but you are seeing that the economy is also being, unlike you, the term that you are using, is it what? Servicification. It's being servicified. And it's not, this phenomenon is not only unique to South Africa, it's globally. I was looking actually at the Australian economy. Services, they contribute about 70%, and the industrial sector contributes about 25%, and the rest of the economy. But it is a strong economy. But the debate that we're having in South Africa, the type, I think, which is a point that was raised, I think, even by Isaac, you find that the focus is your low-skilled services, but not your high-skilled services. For me, if we're going to focus on services, we need to focus on high-value segments of the services sector, because the arguments for this is because we have a high rate of unemployment, and they see the services sector being able to absorb that excess labor that the country has. And maybe what we also need to think about, maybe this is in addition to the paper that you've done, maybe as a country we need to also think about strategic frameworks for these tradable sectors. But I don't want to argue that, but I also want to argue that our industry, these are in a way embedded in our industrial policy. One of the key pillars that we're looking at when it comes to the industrial policy is around digitalization, which we see as a key thrust of bringing in this productivity within the manufacturing sector. But we still believe that our industrial policy has to respond to the circumstances that we are facing in South Africa. Because we believe that, you've made the argument quite well, we believe in building the industrial capacity, which is the argument that we are always making when we are facing the criticisms around why are we facing manufacturing? And I like the fact that you are saying, no, do not forget about manufacturing, but you need to elevate the role that services is playing. And already services, they play an important role within the manufacturing sector. So from an industrial policy point of view, we also see the multipliers that the manufacturing sector has. We see it as a key component of bringing value addition, of driving those exports. So I think for me the key takeaway from this paper is that
maybe summarize a bit.
Sorry.
Maybe summarize your point.
Yes, I'm saying the key takeaway, which is my last point. Which is my last point, is that as a policymaker, it validates us as policymakers, and that as we have not done nothing. It's just that the nature of the structural challenge has evolved faster than the policy frameworks that we have had. And I can say there are also other issues that have also contributed to the results that we're seeing. Let me just end it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much for very insightful comments, and Emmanuel will provide a selected response.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions. I think these are thought-provoking questions and pushing us to think carefully about our paper and how to move forward with it. Okay. Elvis, you asked so many questions, so I think with time I'll
take your favorite question from each panelist.
Yes, exactly. So I'll talk about the nature of services and your question on the nature of services and heterogeneity. Okay. And you also mentioned about the wages and everything, right? And this is a very important issue. So if you look at the evidence that Calumn presented, what is really driving, across different decades, we can see that labor productivity growth is quite balanced across sectors. Manufacturing contributing, agri contributing, and then services, both tradable and non-tradable services contributing to this growth. But if you look at the post-structural emergency period, that's the 2020s, you see that it's only non-tradable services that is driving this recovery, right? And you have a point that in these sectors like hotels, accommodation, and so forth, and personal services, wages are low, right? And I think this is where we need what I call industrial policies for services. So randomly, anytime I travel, I randomly speak to workers around, as a typical of me as an economist, to get to see what is going on, and then I interview them a little bit. And last week, as you said, we were in Nairobi, and we were staying in one of the high-end hotels, right? And I randomly selected some workers and asked them, okay, are you directly employed by this? Because if you look at the revenue, if you go to their website and look at the annual report, the revenue of the hotel is quite at the high-end hotel, and they make a lot of money. So it shouldn't be a problem taking care of their workers, right? So, but if you randomly select these workers, what they tell you is that they are not directly employed by these hotels, right? They are employed by third-party organizations, and then they work for these hotels. So one policy here is if these sectors are really driving growth, then we need to take care of the workers. There are so many incentives to do that. And because of time, maybe I will not go into the incentives. But one thing that we can do, instead of establishing, like, in addition to establishing export processing zone, we also need to look at policy in the services sector that can be very growth enhancing. So for example, maybe a little tax rebate, just like we do in the export processing zones, for these companies to employ directly these workers could have substantial productivity effect. So yes, indeed, there's an issue of inequality in services. And this is where we need policy to address some of these issues. On skill requirements, manufacturing is increasingly becoming skill intensive, capital intensive, skill intensive. And if majority of workers in South Africa and other African countries are low skilled workers, they are not going to complement the process. So maybe we should change the policy focus around manufacturing, where in the past we think of manufacturing as the large employer of low-skilled workers. Now it's changing. So you actually need a lot of skills to work in manufacturing. So maybe the policy focus should be on providing the incentives for these manufacturing industries to generate high value added like we see in other countries, to be a source of innovation and also a source of demand for services, right? And this is how we should define industrial policy going forward, and not necessarily an engine of like structural transformation. By this I mean by absorbing a lot of workers from low productivity sectors. Okay, so I think if we change this policy objective of manufacturing employing a lot of low-skilled workers, but focus on innovation and other dimensions, and then allow services, as it's currently doing, to employ workers, for example, by designing industrial policy that is supportive of workers, then we could achieve a rapid transformation. That is my take. I don't have time, but on your question on export services, Isaac, if I can go back to, yes. So you said that services export is declined in South Africa, and that is the fact. But one thing is that yes, we can stimulate services export to other African markets. We can stimulate services export to drive growth. But one thing that we should note is that the sector that is driving employment expansion, that is driving growth, must not necessarily be the sector that is earning the country foreign exchange. So there should be a multi-sectorial approach to industrial policy. So there could be different, one sector, for example, mining, earning the country foreign exchange, and services creating employment, manufacturing creating employment, and so forth and so forth. While I agree with you that we need to expand services export, we must also think carefully that the sectors that are driving growth and employment must not necessarily be the sectors that are earning the country foreign exchange. So, unfortunately, I couldn't touch on your points, but maybe we can discuss it during the break. Thank you.
Are we allowed some questions from the floor, or are we some?
Yeah, so let's do 3 questions.
3 questions from the floor, and then the panelists will have a first response. Yeah. Oh, sorry. 1, 2.
You needed to control the question.
Thank you, Azar Jameen from Econometrics. South Africa stands on the cusp right now of having, of potentially having a minerals boom. How can we convert that into a general boom for the economy right now at this stage, given what you've said? And Professor Aveno's comment about the services sector should not necessarily be seen as a generator of foreign exchange, but rather as a generator of employment. And I'm just trying to marry the 2 issues at the moment.
Great.
Yeah, thanks very much. Very interesting indeed. You referred to the 2010s as an emergency, but I don't know, maybe you didn't have time, but you didn't say why it was an emergency, what caused it. Which I think is important, because if you want to address it going forward, we need to understand what happened and how to avoid that. So could you just elaborate a little bit on your views on that? Thanks.
Did we have a third question?
Sorry, I'll ask the Okay, so I just want to understand your thesis a little better. So is the idea that manufacturing hasn't created jobs and therefore wouldn't going forward, services has and therefore would going forward, or is there more nuance to that idea?
Should we take them, or should we ask the panel first? What would be your preference?
No, I think you guys
should. Okay, let's yeah. You want to?
Let me start very quickly with yours, because I also want to say something to what Elvis said, which is connected. He said there is no example of countries which achieve rapid growth without a strong manufacturing base. That's not true. There's many United Arab Emirates or various Gulf states would be great examples, and they are resource-rich countries that had a flow of capital of value added foreign exchange in foreign exchange coming in through one strong sector, which was not creating much in the way of jobs. So what did they do? A booming services economy formed around this inflow of capital, and this attracted migrants from across the world, and it started with tourism, and now I would argue you could. I don't know if it's quite there, but there'll be a point where you could switch the oil off in UAE, and the services sector would keep on humming, because it's so it's going round and round and round so much, and that would be perhaps what South Africa can do with this forthcoming mineral boom. If it leads to what we would traditionally think is a terrible Dutch disease, where all this revenue is causing a lack of manufacturing competitiveness and an increase in consumption services, well, that's still jobs, right? There's value added coming in, there's jobs being created, but they're not from the same sector, but that doesn't necessarily matter. So that would be a response to that. I'll do this one, and then you do Fouché.
Yeah.
I'll be very brief. So we were deliberately neutral a bit on causes, which I understand is not a fully satisfactory answer for those in the audience. But what we were trying to present, what we call stylized facts of what has happened, divorced from priors, and we did that deliberately because we want, in part because we want to allow the reader from South Africa to fill this in, and in part because we want to, avoid pushing the conclusions towards what we think are, what we expect on the basis of what happened in, various things that happened in the South African economy, some of which have been talked about here. So, there are many things that we can speculate as the causes, and some of these are in the paper. But for me to speak on them would be speaking on things which we don't have proof for with the level of certainty of the facts that we've presented here in the presentation. So I leave it at that. And you
Yeah, so if you look at the employment trend that Calumn showed, you see that for manufacturing, the employment share is declining over time. And for services, it's increasing, right? So, but the idea here is that to develop a competitive manufacturing sector going forward, we shouldn't care so much about the employment side. We should care about the innovation, right? And this will in turn create linkages in the economy and demand for services that can absorb high number of workers, especially low-skilled workers. So that's our position. Okay, thank you.
And just so our point is that the source of country need three things, right? It needs something to absorb labor, it needs something to generate value added, and it needs something to bring in forex. And this was the whole burden of this was put on manufacturing, right? Everybody thought the whole burden of this all three has to go on manufacturing. Why? Because it works so miraculously for China and for other countries. And our argument is that needn't be the case, and maybe cannot be the case. Maybe cannot be the case because South Africa is not China, but also maybe cannot be the case because manufacturing in the 2020s is not manufacturing in the 1990s, right? So that doesn't mean abandoning manufacturing, but it does mean abandoning the idea of manufacturing as this panacea. And the trends seem to suggest that in South Africa, at least in the immediate term, there might be more job potential in services than there is in manufacturing, en masse. And this, so to come back to, and this will be the last thing I say, to Zakis's last point, which was really, really interesting. A lot of the things he said from a policy perspective was so interesting in light of our results, and will definitely lead us to think more about them. But at the end, you said that you would prefer to focus towards high-skilled services because those are generating higher value added. But kind of our point is that actually, well, you can get the high value added maybe from mining, from minerals, from formal manufacturing, from some high school services as well, and there are some strong services in South Africa. But the unskilled employment has to come somewhere, right? It has to be somewhere. And maybe, if on average retail, wholesale and retail isn't the most productive sector, but you can get 5 jobs for every one that we can get in financial services or in manufacturing, then there is some value in that too. And as Emmanuel gave with his resort example, there is possibility for industrial policy. There is even a possibility for industrial policy for informal services activities, so we leave it at that. Thanks.
Perfect. That's not too bad. We are done for this session, so thank you so much to our presenters and discussants. We really appreciate it. We'll be back for the last session at 13:45. Thank you so much.